Welcome back to another one of your Flip Lectures. Today we're going to have a brief introduction to the civil rights movements in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. So when we talk about civil rights in the United States, these are guaranteed in theory by the Constitution. We have civil rights, equality under law. The 14th Amendment says that those protections must be applied equally. But as we've looked at in this course, these rights have often been denied to varying groups of people. And during the Cold War, these groups are going to begin to demand a change. And so this is contextualized with the Cold War in that the United States has to worry about its image in the world. The United States saying that it is the leader of the free world while simultaneously denying rights to people inside the country could lead to potentially damaging images for the United States abroad. Soviet propaganda also focused on this theme as well, and a lot of people believe that there was potential for communists to come in and rile up minority communities, potentially toppling the American government. And so because of this, early in World War II and immediately after the war, there are some government moves to try to ensure some civil rights. World War II sees the first workplace discrimination laws go into place. Executive Order 9981 is going to desegregate the armed forces, as well as just the increased participation and job opportunities brought on by war industries. However, just because there are some advances taking place doesn't mean that the situation is necessarily fixed. And so we'll begin by taking a look at the African American civil rights movement. When we talk about the African American civil rights movement, we are talking predominantly about the problem of segregation. And there's two types of segregation in the United States. One is de jure, by law, and these would actually be laws known as Jim Crow laws that would make racial segregation legal. Different schools, different bathrooms, and it would be illegal for one group to use the facilities of another. The other type of segregation is de facto, by fact, reality. This is the type of segregation that is going to plague urban cities, especially our very own city of Chicago. And so these are kind of the iconic images of segregation in the United States that we associate with this concept of Jim Crow. And so the million-dollar question becomes how to push back against a system that you see as oppressive. How do you agitate for your rights? And so early on in the civil rights movement, there are going to be a lot of debates about the proper strategy to take. But by far, the most famous organizations, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, are going to favor the strategy of nonviolence and civil disobedience. And so civil disobedience is the idea that you break an unjust law and you peacefully accept the consequences of breaking that law. In theory, you only directly agitate, you directly break a law after all legal challenges and negotiations are going to fail. And so the point of nonviolent protest is to really put it on your oppressor to use violence in order to stop you. And so in order to try to kind of keep the moral high ground, civil disobedience is going to be used by this movement. A very famous kind of example of civil disobedience is the Montgomery bus boycott, a nonviolent organized effort for people to stop riding the buses in Montgomery that actually successfully pushes the city to integrate the buses. Also to the Freedom Riders, who were people who rode buses across state lines to prove that segregation in the buses was illegal. They too were willing to peacefully break the law even when violence was done upon them. And at many stops along the way, these Freedom Riders who are riding buses around the South, they are going to be jumped as soon as they get off of the buses. But all this violence is met with nonviolence, the hope being to get public opinion on the side of the civil rights movement. This also takes the form of sit-ins, where people sit in businesses that they are not allowed to sit in according to Jim Crow segregation and wait to be arrested and sent to jail. In 1963, a series of marches in Birmingham, Alabama are going to turn incredibly violent with fire hoses and police dogs being used, as well as a campaign of bombing by domestic terrorists, some of them associated with the Ku Klux Klan, to try to intimidate these groups into not asking for their equal rights. So beyond nonviolence is also going to be the legal battles in the courts, because if the law says equality, then in theory the courts should be able to help. And so in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education is going to overturn the idea that schools could be segregated. And so this idea of separate but equal, this legal principle that had kind of helped with segregation, is going to be declared unconstitutional. However, just because a law is declared unconstitutional doesn't mean that people immediately stop following it. And so it would actually take the United States Army as well as some U.S. Marshals to integrate some of these schools. The Little Rock Nine becomes kind of the most famous of these people, but it requires the federal government in order to try to come in to make sure that these students are able to attend school. The following year, the public schools closed their doors to prevent integration, and so we're seeing that there's a lot of resistance to this idea of desegregation of schools in the South. But ultimately, the civil rights movement, as a nonviolent organization, grows and builds throughout the 1950s and 60s, culminating in a lot of ways in the very historical March on Washington, where Martin Luther King Jr. gave the very famous I Have a Dream speech, in which he outlaid the hopes that he had for an America after the civil rights movement. And so all of this agitating had, in fact, turned a lot of public opinion in favor of civil rights. And by 1964, President Lyndon Baines Johnson had been convinced to back the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which gave the federal government the authority to go into all of the states and make sure that all civil rights were being applied equally. And so, according to this law, all forms of public discrimination based on race, gender, ethnicity, or religion are banned. And it also guarantees the voting right to all who are eligible to vote. But even with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, changing the realities on the ground would be much more difficult. And so nonviolent marches in order to try to integrate cities, march for housing and jobs are going to continue, oftentimes still resulting in violence. And so the Selma to Montgomery March at the Edmund Pettus Bridge is going to turn violent, thus showing that even with some of these legal gains, the battle in America's streets is going to rage on. And it is precisely these battles that causes the major conflict of the civil rights movement. Those who believe in nonviolence and those who believe that force is required, as well as those who are trying to fight for civil rights in the South versus those who are trying to fight in the North. And so while the South is focused on ending Jim Crow segregation laws, in the North, the reality is a lot more complicated. Chicago itself was the most segregated northern city. It did not have open housing, limited economic opportunities for minorities, segregated schools, racial violence. And so the attempt to end all this, the Chicago Freedom Movement, which was actually led by Martin Luther King Jr., worked along with the Coordinating Council of Community Organizations to try to integrate parts of Chicago. This is going to fail, and the city is going to remain very segregated up into the modern day. There was also something called redlining, in which banks, as well as the government, would look at a map and decide where they were going to give people loans to buy houses, to open businesses. And as we can see from the red, the predominantly black areas of Chicago are going to be denied a lot of this investment, as well as a lot of these loans, thus solidifying the segregation in the city that we still see today. In fact, it gets so bad that in 1963, there is actually a call for a boycott of all Chicago schools because parents believed that these segregated schools were giving their children a subpar education. And so on October 22nd, 1963, in an effort to try to oust the superintendent of schools, Ben Willis, Chicago parents pulled their students from school in order to try to effect change. And so it's these more types of direct actions that are going to become more and more popular as the civil rights movement goes forward. One particular leader by the name of Malcolm X advocated a strategy of by any means necessary. He said he would use nonviolent means, but if those failed, that he would be more than willing to use force in order to gain the civil rights that he believed that they deserved. Robert F. Williams in 1951 also publishes a book called Negroes with Guns, in which he advocates that in places where the police did not defend African Americans, that they should stockpile weapons and form their own militias in order to protect their communities. And so these are different ideas going very much away from kind of our view of the civil rights movement as one of only nonviolence. Then that nonviolent movement is actually going to split with a movement called the Black Power movement. And so this is going to be embodied by a man named Stokely Carmichael. He was a leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He had been a previous freedom rider, but he disagreed about nonviolence, saying that until the other side was willing to also engage in nonviolence, that he could not be held to that standard. And so a new idea comes out, not necessarily one about integration, but one about building up the community of African Americans in the United States. This ends up being called Black Power. And it's the idea of giving political power as well as control of neighborhoods to the residents who live there, as well as building up a sense of pride in the culture. This is going to renew kind of an interest in Africa, and it is also going to be one of the big things. It's going to lead to the start of the Black Panthers. And so Black Power is going to show up in a lot of places. It shows up in the Olympic Games, and it's going to show up on the streets of American cities. And so on the streets of American cities, the Black Panther Party becomes kind of the very visible face of the Black Power movement. It's founded in 1966 in Oakland, and it begins as armed citizen patrols who they say are observing the police to look for any violations of the rights of African Americans. Inevitably, this leads to firefights with police, and so both sides are kind of fueling violence on the streets of Oakland. However, the Black Panthers also said that you can't just defend your community, you have to build it up. And so they actually came out with a bunch of social programs, such as free breakfast for children and health clinics that they opened up in order to try to lift up the community. And so one half of the Black Panthers was all about providing the social services they said the government would not provide to their people, whether it be clothing, breakfast, or health care. And so that's one aspect of it. But the other aspect is going to be this of armed struggle. And the two of the major leaders, two out of three of the major leaders of the Black Panthers, Huey P. Newton and Eldridge Cleaver, are both going to be arrested and charged with the murder of police officers. And so you have, on the one hand, this current of violence, of resisting the U.S. government, and on the other, you have this idea of building up a community. Also, too, in order to kind of tear down the illusion of the gun-toting Black Panther, the vast majority of the members of this organization were indeed women. And so this is a time in which a lot of people are trying to carve out a place within American society for themselves, not content to let others make choices for them. But on the other hand, these armed groups represent a threat to the United States, at least according to J. Edgar Hoover. Like George Kennan had warned of groups that might try to subvert the United States from inside, J. Edgar Hoover viewed these Black Panthers as well as other kind of racial nationalist organizations as a threat to the security of the United States. And so because of this, they began covert operations to infiltrate and destroy all of these organizations, believing that they were the vanguard of a communist revolution and a threat to the U.S. way of life. But the Black Panthers, for their part, put out what they believe in the 10-point program, which we will read in class. And so, although the image of the Black Panthers is violent, much of what they ask for is not. And in Chicago, the Black Panthers were epitomized by a man named Fred Hampton, who managed to band together groups of poor Latinos, whites, and blacks into Chicago's first and only successful Rainbow Coalition. But Fred Hampton was also targeted by the FBI, and he was killed by Chicago police while he slept in his bed in an apartment in Chicago. And so for a lot of the members of this movement, they see their leaders being assassinated, and they believe that violence is acceptable in self-defense. And so eventually the Black Panthers split over the idea of trying to create an armed revolution versus trying to create survival programs. And ultimately, the Black Panthers are going to end in 1973 by trying to go into mainstream politics, by running one of their leaders, Bobby Seale, for mayor, and they come very close. But ultimately, they fail, and the Black Panther movement is going to begin to fade away. But outside of just the African American civil rights movement, this is a time where a lot of marginalized groups are standing up to demand rights. One of these groups is the American Indian Movement, or AIM. And its purpose was to just improve conditions for American Indians. And so they come up with, similar to Black Power, an idea called Red Power. And they're going to do a couple of high-profile things to try to raise the status of American Indians in the United States. First off, they're going to occupy Alcatraz, claiming that it was their land, and they issued a statement saying that they were in possession of Alcatraz and that the United States government were the aggressors. They also, in 1973, took a military takeover of Wounded Knee, a site of an 1890s massacre of their tribe. It's going to last 71 days. This is going to end up in an armed shootout in which a couple people are going to be killed, But ultimately, these people believe that this is what is necessary to try to take back what they have lost from the U.S. government. Elsewhere in America, in New York City, the gay liberation movement got underway with the Stonewall riots in New York City. The police have been harassing the gay community because homosexuality was illegal in a lot of places. And so after a raid at a place called the Stonewall Inn, a fight and a riot broke out amongst the police and the people inside. And so this, for the first time, is going to be a direct confrontation between the local authorities and the gay community in New York. And so what this is going to do is it's going to turn into an organized movement to protest laws and to fight for cultural acceptance in the United States. And so Stonewall began to become the image of resistance. And so, again, sometimes you need a big event to organize around, and Stonewall is going to kick off the long gay liberation movement in American history. The women's liberation movement is also a piece of this same time and place, as well as the Chicano movement, which is going to be predominantly in the American West and Southwest. So like we talked about earlier in the year, ethnic Mexicans in the United States have had a very tough go. Mexican labor conditions were very, very tough. Braceros were brought in and discriminated against heavily. And as well as, the majority of Mexicans who had lived in the U.S. going back to the Mexican-American War had largely been taken advantage of and exploited. And so in a lot of ways, in a lot of these places, the Mexican Americans are going to be treated similarly to other racial minorities and are going to have violence and discrimination done against them. Mexican American children were also put in inferior segregated schools, oftentimes with worse facilities. And so what that led to was a lot of people believing that it was time for this group of people to stand up and take their place in America. And so Cesar Chavez begins organizing some of the migrant labor and the people working in the fields. And so ultimately the Chicano movement, as far as the labor element goes, is going to be very, very successful. Migrant workers are going to successfully unionize. They're going to get a contract. They're going to get the country behind a great boycott to put pressure on California farmers. And so on the one hand, the labor movement is growing. But also, too, urban Mexicans in the United States are having a much harder time, are having a different hard time. Racial boundaries in neighborhoods are aggressively policed, especially in cities like Los Angeles. Deportations and arrests would happen very often, and the idea of Mexican Americans as a political group hardly exists at all. And a really great example of this is the Zoot Suit riots. And this violence of the Zoot Suit riots, it is not atypical, it is characteristic of the relations between the Mexican American community and their white counterparts. Then in 1954, the U.S. government, in an effort to deport a lot of the braceros who had come during the Second World War, the U.S. government's going to do something called Operation Wetback, a mass deportation. There are widespread allegations of abuse, and a large number of U.S. citizens who just happen to be of Mexican heritage are also going to be deported, thus kind of showing us this is much more about race than it is about citizenship. Then a few high-profile events are going to catapult Mexican-American civil rights into the national scene. The first is the affair of Private Felix Longoria on the left. He was a war hero from the Second World War who, when his body came back to his town in Texas, the Three Rivers Funeral Home refused to prepare his body and let him have a wake there, believing that the whites of the local community would not like it. And so what this did was create an incredible amount of outrage that a war hero could not even be waked in the same funeral home as whites who had not fought in the war. And so several organizations of veterans called the GI Forum and LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens, are formed in order to start making legal challenges to discrimination in the United States. And in 1954, Hernandez v. Texas is a key Supreme Court case that is going to apply the protections of the 14th Amendment and the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution to Mexican Americans for the first time. However, legal victories are not going to solve all of the issues of poverty, segregation, and racial violence. And so a political organization is needed. And so this man, Rodolfo Corky Gonzalez, becomes one of the earliest organizers of young politically minded Chicanos. So he's based out of Denver, and he organizes a lot of new types of meetings because he did not believe that the Democratic Party was representing Mexican Americans well. And so he organized the National Chicano Youth Conference, the Vietnam Moratorium, in which he sought to bring together the next generation of Mexican Americans in order to try to effect change. And so they focused on things like education and the poor conditions in the school and poor treatment that they had. And so in 1968, a group of students organized to walk out of schools in order to demand better conditions. And this energizes the Chicano movement because it empowers young people to believe that they can affect change in their lifetime. Then a lot of Chicanos are going to oppose the Vietnam War and draft, saying, why should we be drafted to go fight in a war that for a country that does not acknowledge us as equal? And so in a lot of ways, this movement is coming up, has a lot of the same complaints of all of the others. And so the LA walkouts are able to put pressure on the East LA School District to make changes. And this movement is going to continue to push for more access to education, to professions, and to fight against stereotyping in the United States. However, there is also this idea of resistance, that if we cannot be a part of the United States, that we should fight against the United States. And so there's a creation of something called Aztlán, which is a mythical homeland in the American Southwest that never really existed. However, the idea of Aztlán is the idea of having a homeland, of living between the borders of the United States and Mexico, but actually having a homeland and identity of their own. And so out of this growth of resistance is going to come, similar to the Black Panthers, the Brown Berets, a militant group of people who are going to arm themselves for what they believe is community defense. And so what this is going to all result in is the politicization of a group of young Chicanos who are going to be the first to push successfully into American government. And so early civil rights successes in the 1950s and 60s and 70s enabled and emboldened the next generation of people to push for even more access and rights to make America live up to its promise of equality.